Hi YouTube, this is Terminator TX3, and in this video, I'll be talking about how to create a digital-only service with dedicated gaming hardware. And the topics I'll be talking about: backwards compatibility, never drop distribution servers for discontinued hardware, maintain the basic controls from previous generations is ideal, slow down standalone game development, do not lock or block content or devices, installs, downloads, and upload speeds needs to be fast. Focus on functions, features, and device compatibility. Who can benefit from this ideology? And who is doing this right? This is a long video, so I highly recommend most people look at my description and click on the time codes so you can jump to certain sections of the video. Otherwise, enjoy. So the first thing I want to talk about is backwards compatibility. And the three things I want to talk about here is: don't reinvent the wheel, add to it, avoid multiple controller inputs to support previous software. And this is where good hardware design meets good software design. So first off, don't reinvent the wheel, add to it. So for example, if the hardware of the previous generation you invested in a chipset, why not upgrade that chipset? Why not alter that chipset? So that way previous software is more compatible. And this is entailing with the Xbox 360, Wii, and PlayStation 3. This is the first generation where they attempted, or console manufacturers attempted, a digital distribution market, or attempt to tap into that market. And the thing you don't want to do is have the digital content purchase from your consumers to be worthless in the next generation. You're going to lose consumers' trust when you do that, because the reason why mobile market is thriving is because they don't segregate purchases from generations of products. So if you have an iPhone 4 and you bought a game with the iPhone 4, I can play with iPhone 7, for example. But with dedicated hardware, they tend to reinvent the wheel too much. So if I bought a digital game on Xbox 360 and maybe the Xbox 37, it won't work. Something like that. Or maybe Xbox One, it won't work. Or it's a struggle for them to actually implement it. Like, for example, the Xbox One had to go through a process of converting previous digital software to the Xbox One. It shouldn't be like that. It should be one unified system across all hardware, because it should be compatible with that hardware. If you're going to ditch the previous digital content purchased from the consumers are going to be less likely to purchase digital content with the next hardware, because then if they purchase that and if the service is still up and you want to upgrade, you're going to be stuck with that hardware. So therefore, you're sort of forcing consumers to change instead of making them change on their own. So if you get rid of that choice for the consumers are less likely to accept it. Even if they're going to do it anyways, if you take that choice away from them, then they're going to feel like they're getting less value out of the product, even if they're going to change eventually. You just don't force the change. You make them willingly change because it's just the times are changing. So the next subtopic I want to talk about is avoid multiple controller inputs to support previous hardware. So this is what Nintendo does a lot. So they have like about maybe 5-6 controllers for the Wii U. So they have like a Pro controller for Wii, and then there's a Wii U Pro controller. Then there's like a Wii nunchuck and remote, and then there's like 3DS as a controller. And I think there's maybe a couple more I'm not even aware of. Maybe like GameCube controllers, I think. So when you're adding too much controller input or too much input devices to add to the device, then you're losing the market, because you want to have the default input device to be compatible with previous hardware. So this is when you have to have consistency and just add to what you previously had. So with the Wii, it had motion controls. So there's no alternative options unless they actually alter the software to adapt to the default input device. So with Nintendo, they get praised because they're so original. But if you become too original, you're basically starting from scratch again. Especially if there is a digital distribution service, you want that digital products to be transferred over to the next hardware. So if I bought something on the Wii, I should be able to still play that product on the Wii U. But if it's available on the Wii U and I need another controller to play that particular software, then you're doing it wrong. You can still have controllers there as an alternative, but just that. It's just an alternative. It's not the default input device. So therefore, if I'm playing on the Wii U and I'm playing on the Wii U gamepad, I should be able to play all games with the Wii U gamepad, whether it's Wii or Wii U. But if I'm playing a Wii game on my Wii U, I shouldn't have to change my default input device because it's not compatible with the Wii U's default input device, because that's the hardware I bought. So therefore, it should be compatible. And this is where dedicated gaming hardware fails, because they try to reinvent the wheel too much and they customize things too much. And a thing to take note is PC games or PC platforms don't do this. Like, they have multiple controllers, but on the PC it's more standard. So I might have a controller like an Xbox 360. That's an alternative controller, but I can still use that with multiple software. So basically with the PC, the input devices change according to the type of game it is, than whether it's compatible with the previous generation of PC games. So that's the difference, and that's why PC games or PC platform can get away with it, and dedicated gaming hardware cannot, because it relies too much on the default input device. And the last point is, this is where good hardware design meets good software design. So this is looking at Apple's iPod hardware specs, especially the chipsets are a variation of the same chip but being upgraded. Even though Apple gets criticized for pretty much releasing the same kind of hardware but with slight more upgrades, even though people make fun of that, in the end, they are winning because they have the most apps on the mobile market, because it's easy to convert those apps over. So maybe the iPhone 3 cannot play iPhone 4 games, but the iPhone 4 games can play iPhone 3 games, for example, or apps. Even though certain hardware or platforms get made fun of, they're doing particular things right over other platforms that are more praised. Even though iPhone gets criticized a lot, they're doing the right thing, especially if they are a digital-only service. And same thing with PC. PC has a very similar ideology. And the thing with PC, you're forced to do this. So therefore, that's why PC sort of thrives on this, because with dedicated gaming hardware, the manufacturer or hardware manufacturer has control over this, while the PC, it's a no man's land. Anyone can make software and distribute it on the PC. So this ideology in itself basically follows this. Everything's basically backwards compatible, because the platform is programmable, and also it's free form. Like it's a no man's land. No one doesn't really own anything. Even though you might have Windows operating system, you might have Steam on your computer. Steam is not Windows. It's not associated with Microsoft. It's just on their operating system, but it's not Microsoft. So therefore, you're supporting a digital distribution service on top of an operating system. Microsoft has their own digital distribution store, but it's just default or built into the operating system that's independent from the Steam store. So therefore, it's a no man's land. Anyone can jump into the PC market and create their own digital distribution service. The next topic I want to talk about is never drop the distribution servers for discontinued hardware. The subtopics for this is unifying the distribution servers across all hardware. Dropping multiplayer is not the same as removing content from digital distribution servers or services. And take note from the PC and mobile markets. So with the first point, unifying the distribution servers across all hardware is basically just that. Making sure that even if, like for example, the PSP is discontinued, still have the PSP digital distribution servers still up, or services still up. So therefore, people who buy that content or that hardware is able to still buy content on that hardware. And then The second point is with the multiplayer is not the same as removing content from digital distribution services. So for example, if it's not a persistent online game, you can have consumers rent servers for online multiplayer. So multiplayer only games can still thrive on a digital only service. And then taking notes from PC and mobile phone markets. For example, with the PC, there's PC games still having online to this day. Like for example, WoW. WoW is still popular and that's a PC game. There are still various other PC games on Steam that are supported with multiplayer even years later. So you can still play, I think, Halo 1 on multiplayer, like online. Probably Halo 2. But you can't do that with the original hardware of Xbox. But you can with PC. So you can still play maybe, I don't know, anything. Anything basically on PC virtually still has servers up. Or if the servers aren't up by the creators, someone has servers up so they can play those games online. Or those games are versatile, meaning that you can put up servers so those games can be up on your servers so you can play against your friends. Maybe have like a LAN party or something. But those games still thrive even though they're multiplayer only. The next thing I want to talk about is maintaining the basic controls from the previous generations is ideal. So this is going back to don't reinvent the wheel, add to it. So if one generation you add a touchscreen or a touchpad and it wasn't used that often, so in the next generation you remove that, you're actually hurting yourself. Even if it wasn't used often, having it there makes it easier for it to be compatible with previous software. If you eliminate something that was implemented with the last generation, with the new generation, then you're shooting yourself in the foot. Consistency and simplicity goes a long way. So my next topic is slow down standalone game development. So this is talking about why release a standalone game if it can be downloadable content. This was talked about briefly with my PlayStation Vita video about why it's failing. But generally speaking, when you release content quickly, you're actually rewarding instant gratification. When you delay instant gratification and becomes a delayed gratification, you create a more appreciation and understanding while not putting all your eggs in one basket. So basically, you're spoiling your consumers. You're creating an expectation where it's going to be harder for you to actually maintain. So therefore, you're actually hurting yourself by releasing content rapidly. If you release content sporadically, gamers will adjust to that since that's all they have to do. They can't force you to release content right away. But if you get consumers used to content being released right away, you're actually holding yourself to a standard that's going to be hard to maintain, then thus crippling the industry. Therefore, it's going to be harder to make games because they expect the games to be rushed out fast. Gamers only get bored when developers release new content. So when looking at Left 4 Dead and Left 4 Dead 2, basically that competed with itself. If a particular game is selling, is say you want to sell a game, there will be a fan base with your game. So therefore, you won't have to compete with other platforms or other games. Theoretically speaking, you do, but overall, they will have a following. And the more you slow down the game development, the more people will come in. But if people have to buy the game right away, and there's thousands of people on it right now, and then there's a new release, then they're going to be left behind. So you sort of leave behind certain consumers, and you only can maintain that niche market. But if you want to maintain what you already have and gain more popularity, you slow down game development or standalone games and focus more on DLC, but more sporadically. Don't release DLC the day of the standalone game. That makes no sense. You're putting all your eggs in one basket. If it fails, you fail miserably. While if you have that standalone game released, fix the bugs that happen with launch, and then release DLC sporadically, kind of like Destiny or World of Warcraft, your game will last longer and people will be more willing to join the foray if the life cycle of the game is not so short. So if the life cycle of the game is longer, there's more people willing to buy it. Because sometimes when you release games too quickly, you actually hurt your own fan base. You hurt your own community, thinking that you're competing with others, while there are people who are willing to try other things. But if it's dead, they're less likely to buy it, especially if it's going to be digital content and going to be available to everyone. Keep that in mind. Slower development creates a bigger fan base, because there's a lot of people who will play a game but won't play your particular game yet because the life cycle is too short. But if it's longer, you get more people into it and doesn't get as boring while you're releasing DLC to freshen up the gameplay. Keep in mind, when you release digital content, especially DLC is going to be worthless if the community is dead. So therefore, slower development and more DLC, but sporadically, creates a bigger community and a stronger following. The next topic I want to talk about is do not lock or block content and devices. So the subtopics about this is region locking games, region locking hardware accessories, locking game content within a purchase. So about region locking games, this is what Nintendo tends to do, but basically if you're going to region lock a game, if it's a physical game and you're going to make it digital, kind of like what Xbox is doing or Xbox One, this is a bad thing. So why region lock it? But technically speaking, this should not be a factor with digital content, because stores are segregated by regions. So unless you're able to switch regions like Amazon, this should not be a factor. But if you're going to be like Xbox, where physical content is treated like digital content, and then that physical content or physical disk that the software is stored on is region locked, then this is going to be a problem. Because if it's digital content, it shouldn't be region locked like that. But theoretically speaking, this should not be a problem. But Xbox created this concept, so therefore it's a problem. But they went back on it, but the default settings for the Xbox One reinforces this, so therefore it's a problem. And then the next one is region locking hardware accessories. This is what Nintendo does. So therefore the Wii U gamepad, if your Wii U gamepad fails and then you want to buy another one off of someone else, and that Wii U gamepad is associated with another region, that Wii U gamepad will not work with your Wii U if it's in a different region. So if I'm in the North America region and I get a Wii U gamepad from Asia, that Wii U gamepad will not work with my Wii U. Why? That's wrong. Don't segregate the audience like that. The consumers, I mean. I understand you're trying to withhold standards within the countries, but it hurts the industry, and this hurts more the consumers. And, well, I guess it hurts more, theoretically speaking, it hurts both ways, because therefore, if it's not selling in a certain region, people are willing to buy that content or import it into their region, therefore helping the creator out while still allowing the customer enjoy the product. But I think region locking actually hurts both ways. And with dedicated hardware, gaming hardware, they tend to control too much of the gamer and don't allow them to have a little bit of freedom or leg room. And the next one I want to talk about is locking game content within a purchase. So this basically means, well, this happens with a lot of physical games. Is say, for example, I buy Halo 5, and then within the Halo 5 disc, there is content on that disc that is locked. And in order for that to be unlocked, I have to pay a price. And then it's unlocked off of the disc that I already purchased. This is bad practice. If you're going to do this with digital content, you're going to cripple the industry, and PC is going to dominate like crazy. Because in the PC market, you don't have that kind of control. So if you're gonna create an ecosystem where you have a lot of control, try to emulate successful platforms. Mobile market and the PC platform is very successful with digital distribution, and figure out why that is. They don't have that much control over the consumers. They present choices, and those choices are controlled by the creators, but they allow the consumers to choose, so therefore they're more willing to accept the choices. even though theoretically speaking, it's not a real choice. They're presented with what the creators want them to be presented with, and then the consumers choose to do what they want with that, creating an illusion of choice. So therefore, they're more accepting to what you want them to do, instead of forcing them to do what you want them to do. This is what hardware manufacturers tend to do. They try to force the consumers into what they want, instead of try to present it in a way that they're more accepting to it, and they choose it instead of forcing them to do it. So this is what it goes down to. So going back to the kind of getting sidetracked. So going back to the locking sections of the purchase content away from the consumers, this is bad practice. People are willing to pay if they think the game is good. If you're going to have bad practice, you're going to cripple the industry and hurt the economy. And it's either the gaming community is going to be crippled completely, or mobile and PC market is going to thrive and everything else is going to die out. So the next topic I want to talk about is installs, downloads, and upload speeds need to be fast. So the only dedicated gaming hardware that I know of that's doing this well is the PlayStation 4. The PlayStation 4 is probably the fastest console right now that downloads digital content or downloads anything from a disc, and you'll be able to play it the fastest. PC is pretty fast. Like when I download a game on Steam, it's actually pretty fast. When I'm talking about independent gaming hardware outside of PC, the PlayStation 4 is probably the best. It's second best to PC. So when I'm popping in a game like Destiny, I can play the game within 1 or 2 minutes. If I pop in a game like Destiny in Xbox One, I'll be playing the game probably 30 to an hour later. And while with the PS4, it's still downloading, but I'm able to play it while it's downloading. And say, for example, I bought Call of Duty Advanced Warfare on the PlayStation 4 digitally. I'm able to say, can I download the campaign first or the multiplayer? Campaign is actually better than multiplayer from my experience, but I'm able to do that. If I download the same thing for the Xbox One, it downloads everything, and it probably will take even longer to download. I can probably download 5 to 7 games on the PlayStation 4, while one game is being downloaded on the Xbox One. That's how slow it is. If you're going to have a digital-only distribution service, download speeds must be pretty fast. Installs must be pretty fast. Uploads must be pretty fast. It doesn't have to be blazing fast, but at least getting to the content faster than any other platform besides PC and PlayStation 4. Those two platforms are doing it well. Everything else is just too slow. The next thing I want to talk about is focus on functions, features, and device compatibility. So this is like social functions and features. So chats, messaging, video clips, tags. Try to make it more interactive with other consumers who bought the product or consumers who have brand products and somehow communicate with each other. So the more connected the community is, the more likely people are going to stay and also buy products and brands associated with that manufacturer or company. So Nintendo does not do this. Nintendo kind of controls you in this aspect where they don't want to have voice chat in video games or like multiplayer games. They don't want to have video clips. They don't want to have screenshots or something. Or basically anything else that is standard on any other platform, Nintendo tends to not do. Because they've been selling consoles, but I think they've been selling solely on fluke. But then as the industry gets more mature and as consumers get smarter, Nintendo will slowly die if they don't change with the times. But in general, instead of focusing on raw specs and everything like that, try to focus on the capabilities of the hardware and how compatible it is with other devices, instead of trying to take over other devices like some platforms will try to do. If you try to take over another device, you're going to fail miserably, and you're going to have wasted resources on something that's already been done with something else and probably more efficiently with something else. So the next topic I want to talk about is who can benefit from this ideology. So Microsoft's design of the Xbox console shows that they don't understand the PC market. Sony's lack of knowledge in software design shows when basic CRUD operations are missing. Nintendo reinvents the wheel too much and segregates their consumers. So going to Microsoft and how they design the Xbox is a reflection of how they don't understand PC market. And this is present with the Xbox's policies. For example, the way they design the Xbox or the software for the Xbox is good because it's upgradable. They seem to adapt well. Or they don't know design on the presentational level, and they don't understand gamers because of the policies associated with the software. So, for example, how they implemented a digital-only service with the Xbox One and how it backfired on them. Because what they basically did was they created a physical disc and treated it like a digital copy. And then on top of that, Microsoft will also block content that was once available on the software day one because DLC is now released. So if you're going into multiplayer, maybe you're able to play Capture the Flags or Team Slayer. Then all of a sudden DLC is released. You can't play Team Slayer or Capture the Flag no more unless you buy that DLC. So they have policies like that. And on top of that, if you're going to have a digital only service or distribution service, having previous digital content from the last generation not compatible with the current software or hardware, that's a major problem because then you're losing consumers' trust because if they buy content now, how are they going to be guaranteed it's going to be transferred over to the next product or hardware? Again, looking back at the iPhone or the Android market, they tend to carry over purchases to the next hardware. iPhone started this and then Android follows suit. So if you can't do that, you're basically behind the times, especially if your hardware is designed solely on digital distribution. One last thing about Xbox and how they don't really understand PC market is that when they unified Xbox Live, they have to cut off support from the previous hardware in order to upgrade the current hardware with the network. So stuff like that can't really happen with the stores. So in some aspects, Microsoft is ahead. In other aspects, their network topology can bring them down in the market space that they're in. So in the console space, that's good enough to a certain extent. But when it comes to like the stores and stuff, hopefully that's segregated enough where the stores or the digital distribution service is segregated from the online multiplayer network. So therefore, if anything needs to be upgraded, even if they stop on multiplayer on the previous hardware, which is somewhat of a bad thing, but if they have to do that, at least the apps or software is still available for download. And going to Sony, they tend to lack basic CRUD operations. So when people complain about not changing their PlayStation ID, that's generally a sign of a bad design, because if your database is unable to alter certain aspects, therefore you probably hardwired certain aspects of a profile that shouldn't have been. So the reason why they probably can't change IDs or why it's going to be so difficult, because they probably use the ID as a primary key instead of using maybe like a two-part primary key or using another field for a primary key. So therefore, when you're changing, like to say, for example, username, you have a separate primary key, which is like something that can identify you as you and not someone else, despite your name. And then your username will be independent from the primary key, something that identifies you. So think of your driver's license number as a primary key, and then your name as your user ID. So even if there's another Terminator TX3, that driver's license number is going to be unique to me. But since this is a user ID, this has to be unique as well. So they probably thought this was a good idea to have the user ID as a unique identifier for each individual, not thinking that they would want to change their IDs or something like that, when in reality what they should have done is have the user IDs a unique identifier, and then having something separate independent from the user IDs to have as a primary key that is also a unique identifier that doesn't change. So it's a way of defining or determining who is who despite their names. So they don't look at the names to determine who is who. So stuff like that in the network where it's like iffy. But then on top of that, their network, the way it's designed in the sense of topology, if I'm correct about it, it allows more freedom. So they allow other companies to associate the IDs to their network. So therefore, Sony doesn't really have to worry about, let's say, for example, Call of Duty's multiplayer. It's not really affected too much on Sony. But if the IDs associated with the Call of Duty is down, then thus the multiplayer is down. But theoretically speaking, I think developers create their own networks and they associate the IDs to the PlayStation. So therefore, in that sense, it's a step ahead because that's what PC gaming is. PC market or platform basically has that ideology or network topology where it's like a free form thing. So they might have independent digital distribution services, but they might associate an ID with another company. So therefore, tying in certain databases together. Or think of it like how if you want to take out money from your bank, but then you're at a different bank. So let's say you're with TD Canada and you want to take out money from a Scotiabank ATM machine. That can happen. Think of it that way. When you're taking money out of your account from a different bank, so they communicate with that bank through that other bank. And that's basically how Sony's network is designed. But then at the same time, you can't change certain things. CRUD, operations, is basically create, read, update, and delete. So I understand you might not delete, it might be deactivate, but everything else should be the same. And they don't have the basic CRUD operations. And it shows the lack of design. And then with Nintendo, they tend to reinvent the wheel too much and segregate their consumers. So think of this as the Wii. With the Wii, they basically segregated the consumers based off of skills. So with many of the Wii games, they didn't have much depth or complexity or challenge with the games. And then there are some aspects of the games which wasn't very much, where they had depth or challenge or something to keep the core audience more interested. But overall, they segregated their user base, and then they sort of abandoned the core audience that actually follows them. And then they went back with the Wii U and tried to associate the Wii U with the Wii. And then that audience that they captured is now confused with the name, and they lost that audience, and they also lost the core audience. So they have a little bit of the casual audience where their skill set is not that strong in games, and they also have a little bit of the core audience where they play a lot of video games, but then they're not so into the casual kind of games or games with not much skill involved or challenge. So they sort of segregated their audience, and they sort of combined the two with the Wii U, but they lost a large portion of it. So Nintendo tries to be too radical in the sense of default control inputs, and they don't really listen or don't try to make their stuff standard to what is trending now. So if the other platforms have voice chat in their games, Nintendo's not going to do that. If they have Rumble in their controller, Nintendo's not going to do that. Like if there's something like trophies or achievements in other platforms, Nintendo's not going to do that. Even Steam has something similar to that, but Nintendo doesn't. Like Nintendo tries to do their own thing. They try to walk to their own beat. At the same time, doing that, you're starting over again. But if everything's gonna move to a digital distribution service, you're gonna have to walk to the beat of everyone else. Lastly, I want to talk about who's doing this right. And some of the things I'll be talking about in this section is Valve's Steam shows that they understand PC market better than Microsoft. The Steam box has potential to dominate the digital-only space. Apple, iOS, and Android OS. So first off, I want to talk about Valve's Steam and how they understand the PC market better than Microsoft, because Microsoft has been in the PC game for years, and they never even thought about having a unified digital distribution service. Like, they still had services, but they never thought of doing that with games. And they went into the console market, and they didn't take that ideology to the console market. And they try to control everything. Because they had the lack of control on the PC market. So therefore, they try to regain that control with the Xbox. And that's the wrong way to go about it. And Valve understands this. Valve has no association with any kind of PC hardware or software besides the Valve Steam digital distribution service. And then the Steam box, the reason why I say the Steam box has potential to dominate the digital only space, because the Steam box unifies the digital distribution service. So this is simulating what's happening on the smartphone market. When you buy an iPhone 4, it's going to be the same app store on the iPhone 5 or 6 or 7 or 8. So the Steam box has potential to dominate the digital space is because they unified the digital distribution service. They might have different views depending on what kind of platform you're viewing Steam on, but it's the same store overall. So if I have a Steam box, I have the same access as I do on the PC. That's something that Microsoft never even thought of until after Steam was released. And then with the Apple iOS, it's the same kind of concept. Once Apple releases an update, all hardware gets that update. So if the App Store gets an update, all Apple products get that App Store update. It's the same all over. But the thing is, with the Apple and Android OS, Apple, it tends to be closed. So this is similar to what Microsoft is doing. And the Android OS tends to be opened. So they allow people to build features onto the device. So if you want to correlate this to like PC, think of Apple iOS similar to how Microsoft handles their operating system versus how Android is. The Android's kind of like Linux of the smartphone community. So there's different variations of the Android OS, kind of how there's different variations of the Linux operating system for the PC. I'm not sure how many different Linux operating systems there are. I'm not familiar with too much of Linux, but there's different variations of Linux, similar to how there's different variations of Android OS. And then with the Apple, it's more unified, it's more closed. You can't create a variation of that app, or the OS, I mean. So it's very closed. You can't do anything about it, or you can't build on it, or you can't associate your own network to it. Everything has to be on Apple products or Apple networks. So think about that. That's basically the difference. And these two products or operating systems are dominating the smartphone community or market is because they unified everything. Android wasn't the same. Android was segregated a lot, similar to how the PS2 was segregated with the network. So with the PS2, you have to create your own ID for each game. Similar to what happened with the Android. When you bought an Android app, once you deleted it, you have to buy it back again. It's kind of similar to like the PlayStation 2, but it's just implemented differently. So with each game on the PlayStation 2, when you went online, you have to associate a new ID with that game. That's very similar to PC. So then I guess they realized that you had to sort of change things. With the Xbox, they unified the online ID, which a large appeal for the Xbox and why it's so popular in North America, because they unified the online experience, which was something that was needed on platforms outside of PC, but that won't work too much with PC. But outside of PC, that's what it needed. And Apple did the same thing with the smartphone community. They unified everything within one ID, and then everyone follows suit. So Xbox created a unified ID on the console market. Apple created a unified ID in the smartphone market. This is basically it. Like, Apple unifies everything. That's basically the key for a digital online service. I mean, that's the key for a digital only online service. So if you're going to create new hardware, stop shutting down digital distribution services on hardware that's just being discontinued, because Apple doesn't do this. I can have an Apple iPhone 4 and still play games on it and buy and purchasing stuff on the iPhone 4. Same thing with the iPhone 6 or 6 Plus or 5 or 5S. Same thing can happen. I can have an Android Galaxy 3 and still play apps on that and still purchase apps on that and get updates and everything on that. Not the same thing when it comes to console gaming. If, for example, the PSP, the store is shut down. There's no more store. So therefore, you're essentially killing the platform when you do that. Even if you discontinue making the device or PSPs, still have the services up, because it will be unified. If you unify everything, it's easier to manage. But if you have bad design, it's going to be harder to manage. So therefore, this is why good design is key, because I think Apple creates good design. They know software design in and out. It shows. Android doesn't necessarily know software design as well, because they have a lot of problems with the Android phones. I find when I use them, they tend to have very simple operations, very taxing on the product or the hardware, and it's not as optimized. And sometimes that's about design, but I won't get into that deeply. But overall, they're doing the right thing. They're in the right direction, as opposed to console gaming. They kill off products too fast. So if you want to have a digital only future, you're going to have to change the ideologies of console gaming. If you don't, console gaming will probably cease to exist, because you're going to have another Xbox One backlash again, and this time it'll be all over, and then PC is going to probably dominate, and console gaming will cease to exist. And another thing I want to add too with Xbox Live, even though it's praised a lot, Microsoft hosts all the servers. So with other platforms that are successful, they allow the creators to create the networks, so they don't have to worry about whether the network is strong or not. So with Xbox and the Xbox Live, they may have bit more than they can chew with the network topology, as opposed to PlayStation Network, where I think developers or creators create their own networks, but they just associate the PlayStation IDs with the PlayStation database. So not all games are created by PlayStation or Sony, and then that way it's more ideal for an expansive library. So therefore, if there's a game that was released 5 years ago and it's not a Sony owned developer, therefore that way Sony doesn't have to worry about it. They just have to worry about the IDs. But then if, say, Uncharted 4 is out and it's been 5 years later, Sony's still worrying about that network, as opposed to Xbox Live. I'm thinking that Xbox Live is created for developers, and then developers are allocated space on the network. So if, for example, Call of Duty is on Xbox Live, is because Microsoft allows that to happen. So that therefore Microsoft hosts and manages that online service, as opposed to PlayStation Network, where I think the creators host and manage their own networks. So when it's segregated like that, it's more ideal to thrive, because that way everything's not solely dependent on the manufacturers, on the hardware manufacturers. So therefore, they're able to expand a lot better and faster, as opposed to Xbox Live, where if Xbox Live goes down, everything goes down. But if, for example, if Call of Duty goes down on PlayStation Network, it's because Call of Duty's network's down. But unless it's PlayStation's network IDs are going down, like databases hosting all that data goes down, then all PlayStation Network databases go down. Or not databases go down, but like they can't connect to the ID, so therefore there's no connection. So there's a problem. So this is like the difference between the two different topologies, if I'm correct about them. That's pretty much all I have to say. So this is what Xbox One can use to survive through this generation. Besides that, comment, rate, subscribe. TX3 out.
Guards crossed the Pontar in the east. Puts them maybe a week's march from Kaer Morhen. If they reach the valley before snows can cover the passes, well, we need to cover our tracks, hide our paths. Speaking of winter and wintering, think you'll come this year?
Maybe. Might bring a guest.